Well, there's no retirement in Islam either. Which man says there's no retirement in Islam, so I shouldn't receive a pension? Which man says about his car, oh, there's no insurance in Islam, so I won't get it insured? No way, because insurance used to be a very controversial topic. Who actually says this? Men don't have the right to say, there's no alimony in Islam, so I won't pay alimony. If Muslim women throughout history had the courage of Hola, if they had her determination, maybe a lot of other problems would have been solved as well. When Hola showed this determination, the Surah Al-Mujadila was revealed, and it says, Allah has heard the statement of the woman who argued with you about her husband. In fact, when we look at the hadith narrations that describe this event, we see that the Prophet's masculinity, which was left incomplete, is completed in these narrations. How do they complete it?
İsten dua. Hello to everyone from Oculo. Dear viewers, today we will talk about the verses in the Quran regarding women. Our guest is Dr. Hidayet Şefkatli Tuksal. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank God, I am well. Thank you.
May God grant you goodness, Professor. Actually, we want to talk about the verses in the Quran regarding women. We want to discuss the balance between men and women in the context of the Quran. In our previous episode, we talked with you about anti-women narrations and mentioned how the verses in the Quran empower women. Now, when we look at today, even though the verses revealed at that time seem to empower women under the conditions of that era, what kind of impact do they have on women today, and how should we interpret them?
Now, generally speaking, we can look at it like this. The idea of empowering women, orphans, those who are economically disadvantaged, and slaves is always present in the Quran. So it's not just about women. There is always an advantaged segment in society. This advantaged group, by fighting wars or generating economic value, both governs society and provides the products or money they obtain to serve the disadvantaged segments of society. Generally, that's how societies function. But the concept we call oppression emerges like this. This advantaged group doesn't fulfill its responsibilities. They use their advantages solely for their own benefit and exploit people. When we look at the verses in the Quran about women, slaves, the poor, orphans, in other words, the disadvantaged groups of that time, we see that there was such a system of exploitation, such a system of oppression, or practices related to this oppression. Certain systemic or personal measures and responsibilities are assigned to correct these issues. For example, what is systemic? For instance, zakat or charity. In fact, the issue of helping one another has been established almost as a systemic practice. Especially during the Medina period, and even after the Prophet's death, during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, when some tribes refused to pay zakat, war was declared against them. From this, we conceive just how important it is. But later on, after the state became wealthier and everyone reached prosperity, the system of assigning personal salaries meant that, for example, zakat lost its importance during that period. However, even today, it still continues to play an important role in social assistance and solidarity. Now, there are mechanisms like this. There are also such mechanisms regarding women. empowering women economically through inheritance or dowry, or by regulating divorce and marriage to abolish or condemn certain practices that are oppressive to women. Aha, aha. Recommending more virtuous and generous behavior in relationships with women. For example, nobody really focuses on this. For instance, there are verses in the Quran where, say, a man intends to marry a woman and sets a dowry for her, like, when I marry you, I will give you this much. But then he changes his mind. In such a case, Allah the Almighty wants him to give a portion of that dowry willingly, for example, even though they didn't get married. When we look at male-female relationships in general, since men are usually the stronger side economically and the ones who control the relationship in a male-dominated system, it's the man who manages marriage and divorce. Because of this situation, it is constantly recommended to act generously, to give more than what is due, to go beyond mere justice. So, not just justice, but a behavior that surpasses justice is always advised. For example, even if a man doesn't like his wife, there is such advice in the Quran. In other words, you may not like your wife, but God may have made her good for you. So there are even such pieces of advice. And as I said, it is recommended to treat each other with generosity and goodwill. So a behavior that goes beyond justice is being displayed. Now, when we look at today, of course, systems have changed. For example, while the Mar was something very important during the time of the Prophet, later on, there were attempts to make it seem less significant. Things like giving an iron ring or reciting a surah from the Quran were considered as Mar, but the women of that time objected to this. For example, when Umar gave such a fatwa, a woman who was present there objected and said, "Oh Umar, how can you say something like this?" Why? Because women had no other economic power except for inheritance and mal. Therefore, jurists have acted more realistically on this issue, for example. And as for the mar, like who gives how much mar to which woman, if the mar hasn't been discussed, how much is the mar for a woman for whom it wasn't specified? When is the mar given? If it wasn't given at the time of marriage, it absolutely must be paid at the time of divorce. So, for the man, this is a debt. Today, in marriages, mar isn't discussed. If mar isn't specified, mar missal applies. The woman still has mar. The man is required to pay a mar equivalent to what women of similar status to her receive. For example, our men never talk about this, but they talk a lot about alimony. Why is that? It's not in Islam. Well, retirement isn't in Islam either. Which man says retirement doesn't exist in Islam, so I won't take a pension? Which man's car? Oh, insurance isn't in Islam, so I won't get insurance. No, because insurance used to be a very controversial topic. Who actually says this? So, men who receive a pension from the state, who benefit from this concept of a social stake, have no right to say, alimony isn't in Islam, so I won't pay alimony.
My teacher does not consider anything an advantage in Islam.
They never let go of those things, of course, but as soon as they see something as a disadvantage, then they let it go. In the end, when we look at the Holy Quran today, we don't see any effort to reach the ideal of gender equality as we understand it today. I mean, why is that? Because the ideal of equality only started to be discussed and debated in the 18th century, and even then, there was in a very rudimentary way. Over time, this idea matured. Back then, it wasn't even something people could imagine. And honestly, it wasn't something anyone was really demanding either. But when we look at the Quran, the issue of justice, and even more so, the matter of goodwill above justice is much more decisive in male-female relationships.
Unfortunately, we've not only lost the sense of goodwill, but we've reached a point where justice doesn't exist. This system now operates in an unjust way. So, Professor, we see that most of the verses about women are addressed to men. They're addressed to men, like tell your women and so on. Or we see that some problems related to women are explained through men. What is the reason for this? I mean, women aren't addressed directly. It's as if men are supposed to convey the message or solve the problems. How should we interpret this?
Well, as you mentioned, some of these are problems caused by men, and they're issues that will be resolved if men correct their own behavior. These problems are either brought up by men, meaning they're the current issues of that time. For example, let's say there's a woman whose husband was martyred in war and she's left poor, without money, and helpless. So that's a problem of that time. Or, for instance, a man forcing his ex-wife to give back her dowry by pressuring her or slandering her during a divorce because he needs that money. Problems like these were issues about making ends meet, problems among women, for example, among the wives of the prophet, or legal issues brought to the prophet. Now, all of these are from that time, and of course, it was a small community, not crowded at all. When something happens, everyone hears it. When everyone hears, it becomes the hot topic of that community. Either someone tells the prophet directly, or because it's talked about, because it's debated. Not all these issues last the same amount of time. For example, in the case of the slander against Hazrat Aisha, some time passes after the accusation before Surah An-Nur is revealed and clarified this was a slander. But let's say when Kala went to the Prophet to complain about her husband, her issue was resolved within a few hours. The revelation is coming, the surah of struggle is coming, and it is resolved. In the end, whether the initiative or those voicing these problems are women or men, since these issues generally stem from men and it's the men's behavior that needs to change, these kinds of verses are usually revealed addressing men. But there are also verses revealed addressing women. Or just because a verse is revealed addressing men doesn't mean it doesn't concern women. It actually concerns both sides. But as I said, the verses are mainly revealed addressing whoever holds the main initiative in the issue.
Could we elaborate a bit more on Surah Al-Mujadila, teacher? So, when we look at it in the context of the place of women in the Quran, how should we view the rights given to women at that time or the struggles they undertook? What do you think?
Honestly, it's a very important point. You know, our old scholars actually didn't want some surahs to be read by women. For example, one of these is Surah Yusuf. Because here there is a woman who is infatuated with Prophet Yusuf. I mean, there's a love story. They thought this could have a bad influence on women. So they used to say, don't let women read Surah Yusuf. It might set a bad example for them, and things like that. Well, I mean, I'm not saying this for sure, but Surah Mujadila could also have been one of the surahs they might blacklist. Because in Surah Mujadila, again in a polygamous household, the man of the house gets angry at one of his wives and says, "You are to me like my mother's back." At that time, this was an irrevocable oath, so there's absolutely nothing that can be done. I mean, there's no solution to this.
Being his wife.
Yes, with this kind of oath, he distances her from being his wife all on his own. But the woman isn't actually divorced either. And she's not really married anymore either. Her status is uncertain. It's this kind of ambiguous situation inside the house. And, of course, after a while, the man regrets it. But since it's an irrevocable oath, since it's such an absolute and final thing, they don't know what to do. He can't go and tell the prophet about it. His wife is the one who goes to the prophet to tell him. Now, at that time, the prophet himself, since he was also under the influence of this, after all, he was someone who grew up within that culture. He also can't see a solution. He considers it to be a very binding oath. And he says to Hala, I can't see a solution for you. But of course, since Hala was deeply hurt by this, she starts to argue with the prophet. We don't know exactly what she said. There are different narrations. But in the end, what she said was this. She doesn't say it like this today. For example, this is what would be expected from women. If the prophet were alive today and I went to him with a problem and he said, well, I just can't solve your problem. That's just how it is. If he said, you'll just have to go on like this now, it would be expected of us to lower our heads and say, O Messenger of Allah, of course you know best, and then turn around and leave.
Aisha.
But Havel doesn't do this, and she isn't criticized for not doing it. Havel says, no. She says, then I'm going to sit right here. She says, and I won't leave until this problem is solved. Now, if Muslim women throughout history had possessed Havel's courage, if they had Havel's determination, maybe a lot of other problems would have been solved as well. When Havel showed this determination, the Surah Al-Mujadila was revealed, and it was revealed as follows. God has heard the words of the woman who argued with you about her husband. This is a very important thing. Now, in both the incident of Ifk with Lady Aisha and the example of Havel, we see this. For example, Lady Aisha also says, well, I know that I am innocent. For example, I never expected a verse would be revealed about me. I thought maybe the prophet would see it in a dream. I never expected a verse would be revealed and recited about me, she says. Women don't expect this, but these things happen. That's why this is a process that makes women the subject and main actors. Even though Hazrat Aisha actually suffered a great injustice in the incident of Ifk, she emerged from it completely pure and spotless, becoming a subject, a person in her own right. And Hala is the subject of this story. Islam is a system that allows for this. For example, in my youth, and even now, I have seen this. Wedding invitations are being printed. The mother's name is missing, or the bride's name is missing. Apparently, it's because Islam's concept of privacy supposedly doesn't allow women's names to be mentioned there. What kind of thing is that? Then how do we know the name of Hazrat Khadija? How do we know Hazrat Aisha or Hala? The names of these women are in all of our books. These don't violate privacy. But today, putting the bride's name or the bride's mother's name on there supposedly violates privacy. These are examples that show just how far we've come from where we started. It's like being more royalist than the king, or being more religious than God, trying to be more Muslim than what God actually wants. This isn't something that God wants. This is actually something that, in the Quran, God criticizes followers of other religions for. In other words, going to extremes, being excessive in religion. For example, God criticizes Christians for forbidding sexuality for themselves, even though God didn't prohibit it, just so they can worship better. He describes them as those who go to extremes. It's like wanting things in God's name that He Himself doesn't want. For instance, something very simple. Take the issue of the curtain, for example. The verse about the wives of the prophet speaking from behind a curtain is something that applies only to them. Why is that? Because back then, houses didn't have doors, they had curtains. People, the companions, sometimes thoughtlessly just pulled back the curtain and looked inside. They are supposed to stay behind the curtain and speak from there. First, this is to ensure the comfort of the women. Second, they have been declared as the mothers of the believers. They will not marry anyone else after the Prophet's passing. Therefore, if they were to interact closely with men, it could lead to all sorts of gossip, and also, on both sides, it could stir up feelings. So this was put in place as a precaution. Even though this rule was established specifically for their circumstances and is clearly stated in the Quran as being exclusive to them, what do our scholars do? They say, well, if it was commanded to them, then it should definitely apply to all other believing women as well. But if that were the case, God could have just said so. So why didn't he? So why are you assigning yourselves a duty that wasn't given to you? Because there's something else going on here. When you put women behind a curtain, it doesn't mean men are left without women. Because in most societies back then, there were slave women. So only free women are kept behind the curtain. But the public space is already filled with men and slave women. I mean, they go out to have fun with them too. They listen to music with slave women, party together, work with them, do business, whatever you can think of. In other words, men are not without women. In our society, especially during times when veiling was really emphasized, people would say women shouldn't be out on the streets, seen or heard, shouldn't distract men or cause temptation. But even during the Prophet's time, and in no Islamic country at any time, were the streets ever without women, men have always been around women. But with slave women, who were even more accessible, they were already mingling and finding ways to satisfy their desires one way or another. But when it comes to free women, their goal was to keep them hidden behind a curtain and restrict them there. Yes, so a rule that was meant only for the Prophet's wives was generalized, but of course, back then, this could also be justified by reasons like wealth, status, or security. So it ended up becoming a widespread practice. But of course, in agricultural societies, there was no such thing. I mean, do you think peasant women just sat at home? Peasant women have been working in the fields, on the ground, and in the gardens for centuries. This kind of life was considered suitable more for urban, more elite women.
So, Professor, finally, if we talk about the Prophet's family life, his attitudes toward his wives, this is also interpreted in different ways today as a very ideal model of marriage. An ideal husband and wife relationship, or rather, relationships. It's seen and described as such a situation. How should we view this in that context? How should we evaluate this network of relationships, these marriages?
Well, everyone knows this. The Prophet Muhammad had a long period of monogamy, and even though there are different reports about her age, for example, according to the Shia, Khadija was not 40 years old. She was single, not a widow. But according to Sunni sources, in the marriage between the Prophet and Khadija, there was actually Khadija who was the provider. What? Because she was stronger than the Prophet, wealthier, older, and more mature, had more experience, and held a higher status in that society. For this reason, it was Khadija who proposed marriage to the Prophet. In fact, when we look at their later relationship, that is, the relationship between the Prophet, peace be upon him, and Khadija, we can see traces of this dynamic. It's not like that. In that relationship, Khadija is not portrayed as a submissive woman, but rather as someone who guides and manages things. However, the Prophet's later marriages, some of them were also marriages based on status. For example, women of high status who were taken captive preferred to marry the Prophet rather than marry men of lower status. Or sometimes the Prophet himself made such a proposal. So, in a way, this could be about intertribal relations or perhaps about comforting those women. Some of them were chosen by Khadija, by the Prophet himself, and some by others, just like with Aisha or with Sauda. In other words, he personally wanted to marry those women. There were also women who wanted to marry the Prophet, but it didn't happen. In the end, according to the understanding of marriage at that time, there was nothing seen as problematic in the Prophet's marriages. In a polygamous system, as someone whose status had risen considerably, a leader, a commander, a religious messenger, his circle and family naturally expanded. Of course, trying to live with so many women, managing them, and keeping them happy, especially since the Prophet was someone who, beyond just being fair, really tried to keep his wives content, was not easy. But we see that he did experience some difficulties here. The difficulty, well, his wives actually split into two camps. They look for each other's faults or complain about one another to the Prophet. Some even involve Fatima in the situation. So there is a constant state of rivalry. And of course, this upsets the Prophet. As you already know, in the end, there's also the story about the honey sherbet incident. Or, this is also interpreted differently in other commentaries. In the end, it even goes as far as plotting behind the Prophet's back. And what's important here is the Prophet's attitude. Now, the Prophet actually feels deeply hurt by all his wives who were involved in this scheme. He is very upset and angry, but he never acts in a domineering or macho way toward any of them. I mean, well, sir, how could you tell me this lie? He doesn't say, how can you make this slander? Who are you? Etc. So what does he do? He distances himself from the house. He withdraws to a place like a small arbor or shelter and stops seeing all of his wives. Of course, this becomes a huge event in Medina. In fact, when we look at the hadith narrations that describe this event, we see that the narrators fill in the masculinity that the Prophet left incomplete. How do they do that? Now, for example, Hazrat Umar comes in. He slaps Hazrat Hafsa. How could you do this to the Prophet? Hazrat Abu Bakr comes in. He slaps Hazrat Aisha. How could you do this to the Prophet? When I read these narrations, I laughed. I mean, the Prophet doesn't act like this. But apparently they weren't satisfied with how things were. Like, how could these women act out like this? And the Prophet doesn't discipline them. He just goes off to a corner. So they decide, let's discipline them properly. And that's where violence comes into play. In the end, there is absolutely no narration that the Prophet ever used physical or emotional violence against his wives. The only exception is during the incident of Ifk, where there are reports that he seemed to somewhat believe the slander against Aisha and neglected her a bit. But Aisha herself responds to this anyway. When Surah Nur was revealed, Aisha's parents said to her, "Daughter, thank the Prophet." And she replied, "Why should I thank the Prophet? He already believed it." She says, "Allah sent down those verses, not the Prophet. It was Allah who declared my innocence." Now, to have that kind of awareness, especially considering that Aisha was young at the time, is remarkable. So, to sum it up, here's the point. Whatever problems people have among themselves today, similar problems existed among the people around the Prophet back then as well. Just because they were companions, just because they lived with the Prophet, it didn't mean they were completely pure and free from all faults. In fact, their shortcomings may have been the reason for the revelation of verses that guide us today. That's how we should look at it. In the prophet's relationships with women, there was no violence, no psychological abuse. He would win their hearts, consult their opinions, and this is something encouraged by God as well. Because in this surah, Surah Al-Mumtahana, God doesn't say, hey, what kind of man are you? You couldn't straighten out your wives. They're overpowering you. How can this be? He doesn't say, assert your manhood. Instead, he says, O Muhammad, gather your wives and tell them. If they want to stay with you, let them. If they don't, let them go kindly, let them leave. So, for example, we always talk about this in relation to Nisa 34. So when there's a problem in marriage, people say do this or do that, but look, there was a problem in the house of the prophet, and God clearly gives advice there. Speak kindly. If they agree, let them stay. If they don't, divorce them, let them go their way. So that's why in Nisa 34, we always interpret Badrul Hun as beating. Why is that? Because ever since the earliest commentators, it's always been conveyed to us as beating, so maybe that's why we understand it that way. Maybe that's how they wanted to understand it. When we compare this example with that, then why would God say something different in Nisa 34 when he speaks to the prophet like this? Maybe what he's saying there is also, okay, if you can't get along, let them go, separate, let the women go. In the end, if we look at it this way, human relationships can be seen as much more civilized, nonviolent, with different alternatives coming into play.
Unfortunately, when we look at today, we see exactly the opposite. So here, while there is a method suggested by God, a solution that our prophet wanted to try and work towards, a method he saw, on the other hand, there are still men today who can't manage to divorce or separate and instead try to keep things going through violence. I hope these examples can serve as guides for our present day. I hope this has opened a window for our viewers. Thank you for your valuable insights, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers. We talked about gender equality for men and women in the Quran. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.